The United States is now pulling troops out of military bases across the Middle East, not rotating them, not repositioning them, actually pulling them out of sites where Iranian missiles have destroyed radar systems, struck runways, and killed American soldiers. Over 200 troops are wounded across 7 countries. 2 U.S. embassies have been shut after direct hits, and the State Department has told every American in Iraq to leave immediately. Iran's retaliation shows no signs of stopping. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Oil prices have nearly doubled. Allies are refusing to intervene, and the U.S. is burning through millions just to keep operations running. Bases are actively being emptied. This is not a war going according to plan, though you wouldn't know it from mainstream coverage, which softens every worsening update. In the next few minutes, I'll break down why American troops are being pulled back and reveal what's actually happening on the ground in the Middle East. The clearest starting point is Kuwait, where the collapse became impossible to hide. On March 1st, a single Iranian Shahed drone struck the port of Shua in Kuwait. It killed 6 soldiers from the 103rd Sustainment Command, an Army Reserve unit out of Des Moines, Iowa. These were not frontline combat troops. They were logistics personnel working at a civilian port. The strike came without warning. That detail is critical. Detection systems that should have intercepted the drone had already failed, and we now know why. Bloomberg released satellite images showing destroyed early warning radar arrays at Ali al-Salem Air Base and Camp Arafan, both in Kuwait. These radars detect incoming missiles and drones before they reach a base. Without them, the facilities are operationally blind. Once those systems went down, the pullback began. Personnel moved out of exposed positions across Kuwait. The U.S. Embassy took a direct Iranian missile strike, and Rubio ordered it closed. On March the 2nd, Kuwaiti air defenses mistakenly shot down 3 American F-15s in a friendly fire incident because situational awareness on the ground had degraded so badly. 6 crew survived, but the warning was clear. These positions were no longer defensible. The U.S. began emptying them. Kuwait was not an isolated case. The same pattern unfolded across the region. In Bahrain, the U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Jufair was hit by Iranian missiles multiple times. Hundreds of non-essential personnel had already been removed before the war began, and the attacks continue. In Qatar, a pair of low-flying Iranian bombers approached Al Udeid, the largest American base in the Middle East, home to roughly 10,000 troops. That base had been partially evacuated twice before February 28th. In Saudi Arabia, Prince Sultan Air Base was struck. Sergeant Benjamin Pennington was wounded on March 1st and died on March 8th. The U.S. Embassy in Riyadh took drone strikes and was shut down. In the UAE, the U.S. consulate in Dubai was hit, and Iranian state media claimed American forces had quietly dispersed into civilian port facilities at Jebel Ali, Khalifa, and Fujairah. Verified or not, that claim signals something important. Iran believes U.S. personnel are moving out of identifiable bases into civilian infrastructure because the bases are no longer safe. In Iraq, the U.S. Embassy strongly urged American citizens to leave immediately. In Syria, troops completed a withdrawal from Aleppo and began pulling out of Qamishli in the northeast. Add it all up, 2 embassies closed after direct hits, a full country evacuation advisory for Iraq, confirmed pullouts from Syria, hundreds relocated from Gulf bases, even before the first shot was fired. 13 American service members dead, over 200 wounded across 7 countries, and the U.S. calls this a tactical withdrawal. The New York Times calls it a redesign of the military presence. The White House calls it strategic relocation. 3 different phrases, all performing the same task, making a retreat sound intentional. And here's what exposes all 3 labels. This is not the first time these bases have been emptied. It is the third. On January 14th, 2026, 6 full weeks before the war began, Reuters reported that the U.S. was withdrawing some personnel from key bases in the region as a precaution. Personnel at Al Udeid were told to leave that evening. Britain pulled its people out as well. The Qatari government confirmed the drawdown. A diplomat told Reuters it was a posture change, not an evacuation order. Troops were scattered to hotels and dispersed facilities, moved away from concentrated targets. This happened because Iran issued a direct warning to every neighboring government. If America strikes, your bases will become our targets. In late January, several Gulf states took that warning seriously. Gulf governments assured Tehran their territory and airspace would not be used by Washington in the war. America struck anyway, and every base partially evacuated in January was hit by Iranian missiles on February 28th, exactly as Tehran had predicted. Then, in late February, days before the joint strike, evacuations intensified. Hundreds of non-essential personnel were pulled from Al Udeid and 5th Fleet facilities in Bahrain. Gulf News reported the moves were to reduce force exposure. Turkey's Anadolu agency ran the headline without spin. U.S. evacuates hundreds of troops from Qatar and Bahrain. The U.S. said nothing. 3 waves, same bases, same direction. Out. And here is the pattern that matters. In January, when nothing had happened, it was called a posture change. In late February, with a strike imminent, it was called a precautionary evacuation. Now, in March, with missiles landing, radars destroyed, embassies shuttered, and soldiers in coffins, they call it strategic relocation. The label softens each time. The reality worsens. Turkish media calls it leaving. Qatari outlets call it evacuating. The Jerusalem Post cited the New York Times' softened framing and repeated it. That is not evolving terminology. It is managed denial. Most believe the U.S. is repositioning forces for a new phase. In reality, it is abandoning positions Iran made untenable, repackaging each retreat with a gentler phrase than the last. Stay with me, because what Iran is doing in the Strait of Hormuz is the part of this war that will hurt long after the last missile lands. On March the 2nd, IRGC senior advisor Ibrahim Jabari announced the strait was closed and any vessel attempting passage would be set ablaze. 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships followed by March 12th. Traffic first collapsed by 70%, then fell to effectively zero for Western-flagged vessels. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait rather than risk crossing. This is the largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s. But here's what most coverage misses. Iran did not need a navy to close the strait. 24 attacks on commercial vessels were enough to break the private sector math. Ship owners cannot get insurance. After the strikes, most major underwriters at Lloyd's of London stopped issuing new policies for Hormuz transit. Crews have the legal right under international maritime law to refuse sailing into a declared war zone. Some captains are reportedly being offered $500,000 a day to attempt crossing. That is not a functioning shipping lane. It is a lottery ticket with a warhead attached. Even if every Iranian naval asset were destroyed tomorrow, the commercial infrastructure enabling shipping through the corridor has already collapsed. Rebuilding commercial confidence takes far longer than rebuilding a ship. 20% of the world's daily oil supply transits that waterway. 20% of global LNG does as well. Brent crude jumped from roughly $65 a barrel pre-war to a peak of $126. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG shipments on March 4th. Merck, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, and CMA CGM all suspended operations. And the damage is spreading beyond energy. URA fertilizer prices jumped roughly $80 a ton from pre-war levels of around $470, hitting farmers just as spring planting began. About a third of global fertilizer trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That price spike arrives just as American farmers enter the spring planting window for corn and soybeans. Iran then made a calculated move on March 5th. The strait is closed to American, Israeli, and Western Allied vessels. But Turkish ships were allowed through. Indian-flagged carriers passed. Saudi tankers heading to India were cleared. China, which receives 45% of its oil via Hormuz, is negotiating directly with Tehran for guaranteed safe passage. Japan, which gets 70% of its Middle Eastern crude through the strait, has already requested its government release strategic petroleum reserves. Iran turned a military blockade into a selective toll booth. America's allies are being forced to negotiate directly with the country the U.S. is bombing, while the American response has been incoherent. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said on March 13th, the Navy is not ready to escort tankers. Hours later, Treasury Secretary Bessent told Sky News the Navy would begin escorting ships as soon as militarily possible. Defense Secretary Hegseth waved it off entirely. Do not need to worry about it. Trump called on allies to send warships. Japan, Australia, South Korea, the UK, Germany, and Greece all declined. Germany said, as long as this war continues, there will be no participation. The UK said it will not be drawn into the wider war. Not one allied nation has committed a single vessel. That isolation is new, and it is significant. Saudi Arabia has begun rerouting crude oil to the Red Sea port of Yanbu through its east-west pipeline. By mid-March, tanker traffic at Saudi Red Sea ports had surged sharply, a visible sign of how much export traffic was being diverted away from Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has pushed far more crude through the east-west pipeline to Yanbu, reaching about 5.9 million barrels per day. The gap remains, and the Red Sea route itself remains vulnerable to disruption. There is no clean workaround. Every alternative route is either too small, too slow, or too dangerous. Now consider what happened next, because this is where the war crossed a threshold most people have not fully absorbed. On March 7th, Iran accused the United States of striking a desalination facility on Qeshm Island, an allegation Washington has not confirmed. The next day, Bahrain reported that an Iranian drone had damaged a desalination plant on its soil. That exchange matters more than it sounds. The Persian Gulf depends on desalination. About 400 plants across the Gulf states produce 40% of the world's desalinated water. Bahrain relies on those plants for roughly 90% of its drinking water. Kuwait, the same. Oman at 86%. Saudi Arabia at 70%. These are not backup systems. This is the entire water supply. Roughly 100 million people in the region depend on these facilities daily. Iran's logic is clear. You hit our water, we hit theirs. The question is not whether the United States is pulling back. That is settled. The question is, what happens when a government runs out of words to describe what it refuses to name? Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your support. Join the discussion in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. Who do you think is winning the war? Is it getting out of hand? Let me know. Please subscribe and like the video to stay updated. Click the video on the screen to watch another. I'll see you soon.